Hello, everyone. Welcome to All the Things.
I am Monique Duson.
And I'm Krista Bontrager, also known as Theology Mom.
This is the show where we talk about all things related to God, the Bible, and real life.
And as you can see, we're still not in our home studio yet.
Not yet.
So we're crammed behind a tiny desk here.
You guys, the struggle's real. But it's okay because we are here together as family on Saturday night. I almost said Friday night.
That's right.
It's not Friday.
And we are live.
Yes.
So we want to invite you to join us on the chat for tonight's conversation, which is sure to be interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. So we do actually read the comments during the stream and try to incorporate some of your questions into the conversation. So make sure to interact with us during the live.
Yes, but don't come at us with the okie doke because we do have chat box moderators. I saw Emily Bontrager in there, and I think Jennifer Bytel is there, if I'm not mistaken.
I think she's supposed to join us possibly. Yes.
Okay.
Emily's there.
Emily is there. And so thank you very much for moderating our chats and making sure that things are on the up and up.
And we could not do this each and every week without the one and only Bob Bontrager, who's back at the house.
Yes. And tonight's show, as always, is brought to you by the Center for Biblical Unity, Theology Mom, and
Family 210 Clothing.
Yes.
And so you got a lot of compliments recently. I don't know if you saw them on Instagram. People saying that they liked your shirt.
Which shirt was it?
Well, the one that says "Truth Has No Color."
Yes.
People can get that shirt.
Yes.
Family 210 Clothing.
Or through the CFBU website. Either one. Yes. Truth Has No Color. Yes. I sported that shirt just the other day. You don't want to know what my shirt says today, though.
You better tell them because they won't see the whole thing.
Today, I know they probably won't. Maybe I have to sit up a little bit. I don't know. I can't see it, but it says, holy enough to pray for you, hood enough to swing on you. That is so bad. I know. I am a work in progress, everyone. This shirt was actually given to me by a CFBU volunteer. Her and her husband said, you know what? Monique needs that shirt. I said, oh my gosh, you do know me.
So what have you been up to?
What have I been up to? I actually have been writing. I feel like I've just been, underwater with writing.
Well, speaking of writing, you had an article come out yesterday.
Yeah, in Christianity Today regarding George Yancey's book.
It was a review of the book.
It was a review of the book. So I did that, but I'm preparing for some things that I'm going to be doing over the summer. I'm going to be at Wilberforce Weekend through the Colson Center in 2 weeks. Just 3 days after that, I'm going to be at Summit Ministries together. We're going to be at Summit Ministries in Colorado. Right after that, we're going to be at the Women in Apologetics conference. So there's a lot of writing that is happening and just trying to keep up with the day-to-day of also running a nonprofit. And so things like insurance and taxes and finance meetings and
people don't know.
People don't know. Like, you don't know the real. Like, no. And so then yesterday I went and I actually got my hair straightened because I was like, you know what? I'm going to do something that's just to take the load off for a minute. Yeah. So I got my hair cut and straightened, and we'll see how long it lasts straight. I mean, don't get me too excited, because if I get too excited, then I'll start to sweat and it'll revert back. If you don't know what revert back means, you should just ask somebody.
We don't have your press.
I will sweat out my press. If you don't know that, you got to ask somebody. Yes.
So are you going to ask me what I've been doing?
Yes. What have you been doing? Yes.
Well, I've been having a lot of meetings.
You do? You have?
A lot of schools contacting us about doing trainings this summer. That's kind of cool. Christian schools wanting help with policy statements or helping them train their staff and teachers, or working with boards on coming up with position statements. Just a lot of different things.
Yeah.
A lot of different schools reaching out to us, been having several meetings along those lines. So it's good. I think I'm looking forward to seeing which ones emerge and come to the top, and who we're going to work with, and new friends that we'll make, and all of that. But I love doing the conversations with schools and churches, because I just really want to help Christ's body to, put in place things to shore up the legacy of the church and the school, so it'll be around for the next generation. How can we hire well? How can we have fair policies for all?
How can we disciple well?
Yeah.
Hey, how was the homeschool show?
It was good.
Read the shirt. No.
Yeah. No, it was good. Was in Texas last weekend, speaking at the Texas State
homeschool show
coalition convention, and it was good. Yeah, I did 4 talks. 3 of them I hadn't done before, and it was pretty well received. I think nobody got up and left in the middle, so
I had somebody get up in the middle of one of my talks and leave.
So yeah, it was good. Let's look. Oh, somebody says your hair looks great.
Thanks, it's my Auntie Linda. Hey, Auntie Linda, Uncle Jeff.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love them. All right.
So, all right. Well, let's get into it here. We've got a really interesting show tonight. Now, we should probably get a little context here, because last year around this time, we did a couple of shows with our friend Eric Muldrow from
Code Red Conversations,
who y'all should be following. Eric does a lot of content on YouTube of analyzing videos, police shootings, but also helping people increase their awareness of their surroundings, and showing like negative examples of, when you're not paying attention and everything, things that can happen.
I find him to be so fair.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this officer was completely out of line, or, oh, this suspect was completely out of line and they should have never done that. And if they would have, just complied or, done whatever, they wouldn't have whatever the situation is, so I find him to be very balanced and not, just trying to support and uplift police or, just kind of dog on police. He's very like moderate and
trying to look at facts and evidence.
Yes. And looking at the statistics and things like that.
No, and we had him on last year. He did a lot to help us address the big question that's on a lot of people's minds of our, particularly Black men, are they being hunted down in the streets?
Yeah.
Because that's an impression I think that the media definitely.
Well, I think that was actually the comment from maybe LeBron James, a basketball player, but I think it was him who said, he didn't feel safe because Black men are being hunted down. So
we kind of tackled that last year, and Eric just broke down all of these different statistics and studies, and is policing an example of large scale systemic racism? Yes. So that's not the question we're going to be.
Not the question tonight.
So if people are interested in that question, go back and check out our conversation with Eric. But we should also say probably up front that we also realize that for some people, the policing conversation is difficult.
Yeah.
Some people have had negative experiences with the police, or they've heard stories from family members, friends that have had negative experiences. And we realize it's a complex issue, and yet we don't want to avoid the conversation either.
No, and
just because it's difficult.
Yeah, we never want to avoid a difficult conversation. I always say, hey, Christians do hard things. Like we can have hard conversations. We can do some of those hard things. But we do want to do those hard things from a very biblical perspective. So I don't want to just, address a hard thing or a hard topic based from a cultural standpoint. I want to say, what does the scripture have to say about this thing first?
Yeah. So we're going to just keep chipping away at the policing issue. We've got a couple other ideas for shows that, we'll do in the future. But tonight, the conversation is going to be about police reform.
Yes.
And so that's what we'll be focusing on tonight. And we're going to be introducing the family to a friend of ours for the first time. Mark Perez. He's now retired from LAPD. We're going to get to know him a little bit. Mark has an amazing resume. He's eminently qualified to help us talk about this, as we'll find out in just a minute here. So you guys are going to enjoy Mark. I've known Mark for about 20 years and introduced him to Monique about 1.5 2 years ago.
More than that.
We went out to lunch. And
when I was still struggling with police and policing issues and, how do I consider police? I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and my mom gave us the talk about, how, if you're ever pulled over, what do you do and how do you do it and why and all of that. And so just coming from that mindset, was able to sit down and have a conversation with Mark about, policing and the realities of it and what he sees, or what he saw being behind the scenes of it all.
Yeah, that was very helpful to you.
Yeah, I thought it was super helpful. We had a great conversation.
Yeah, so we're excited for all of you to meet Mark tonight. So let's bring him on here and introduce him. Hey, Mark.
Hey.
Hello, Monique. Hello.
Hi.
Good to see you both.
Good to see you. And I'm so excited to finally have you on the show. And this is something I've been wanting to do for a long time. So I'm glad the circumstances have kind of aligned now that we can have this conversation. So
good for all of us.
Yeah. Maybe let's just start, since you're new to our viewers, tell us a little bit about your background in law enforcement and, why you're qualified to talk on the issue of police reform.
Sure. Well, first of all, I've spent 36 years in policing, started in the late 70s, ended around 2015. Half that time was spent in the field, the other half was spent as an executive. The important features, there's a lot that goes on in 36 years, but some of the important features of the work that I did was some of the assignments I had that had to do with internal affairs or professional standards, all of which looks at how do you go about investigating officers who are accused of misconduct, how do you design policies and procedures, and for that 7 years, I was also overseeing the officer-involved shooting group, Force Investigation Division. That's where every shooting that occurred in the city of Los Angeles, where somebody got hit or somebody got seriously injured, even if they weren't shot, was investigated very, very thoroughly. So I've seen literally hundreds of those investigations. And if we get into what those are about, I think your viewers would actually be quite shocked to know how deep those go. I've also spent time with other agencies. So that includes agencies outside the United States. I went to Armenia, for example, on a mission with the State Department. And the purpose of that mission was to bring corruption, to reduce the corruption in the Armenian government, and particularly their police forces. And so there are members of the United Nations, as well as other people who were there as part of our delegation to help avoid and prevent corruption in Armenia and the Armenian police. I had the same invitation down to Mexico. I was invited by the federal government of Mexico, also through the State Department. And I've had contact with a lot of other places. So we've had people, when I was working for the police department still, from far away as Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia, and countries all over the world that would come in and visit. And we would talk about that. How do you prevent an organization from going corrupt? I also participated in a very long, multi-year study that resulted in a document that was presented to the Department of Justice. It was a project that was funded by the Department of Justice on best practices in investigating police officers. And that document is still alive today. It's still on the website of the Department of Justice. And some of my friends who are consultants in policing and expert witnesses say that it's still being used in court. I've done court work as well, by the way, expert witness in police practices, and presented cases in federal and in local courts. And I've spent a lot of years, about 11 years, actually teaching internal affairs investigations and how to prevent an agency from going south. For the state of California, Peace Officer Standards and Training. I could keep on going, but I think as we go along, when we're talking, I may be able to explain some of my assignments and some of the work I did that's relevant to my positions or my thoughts on the issues.
Wow, you definitely come with quite a resume.
Yeah.
I can say that for sure. I think that's one of the things that was helpful to me when we sat down and talked was your view on things, but that you had actually been there and served and you had done all of these different things and you were able to give input from different positions. And so, yeah.
Well, in particular, just all your work in overcoming corruption.
Yeah.
And internal investigation that you have for a chunk of your career really been a stand for, hey, we need to make sure that we are doing things fairly and rightly and even helping other governments do better and prevent corruption, weed out corruption. Your work in internal investigations, I think you have a unique resume to help us talk about reforms.
I think what I would say is just policing. How do we police justly is what I think I took away from our conversation. And even in hearing you speak right now, it just harkens me back to an idea of just policing. But let me ask you this. From a Christian standpoint or standard, why is policing important?
Yeah, because our culture is having a whole conversation now about getting rid of the police.
We just need to do away with the police. I said, no. Why is policing important?
Well, I guess the best way to test that question is to ask what would happen if there were no police. So if you had no restraint on the sinful desires of really sinful people, what would it look like? Well, it might look like what it looked like just before the flood, where every person was thinking only evil thoughts continually. Mm. And so if you don't have some kind of restraint on the people who are doing the most evil, people who are doing the worst things, then you will have chaos and you will have all sorts of anarchy and it will be terribly, terribly destructive. The Lord put authorities and allows governments to exist. Indeed, he's the author of governments in order to protect the people. But important to that, and particularly when we talk about police reform, is to talk about whether you protect the people from the police as well. And Romans 13 talks about that. There are people who oversee those. So there's nobody without oversight. And that's probably the thing that I see from a Christian perspective, which is the most protective of all. So if you have no police, you have no protection. But when you have police, you've got to have protection from the police because they have a huge amount of power. So the power has to be guarded as well as exercised in order to protect the population from the evils that we know will go crazy and just completely out of control if we allow Satan to just completely operate the way he wants to.
Would you say that some of that guarding from the police are things like body cameras or reports or things like that? Or are there other mechanisms that you're referring to?
Well, that's part of the mechanism. It's very complicated. Probably the most protective feature of any package of protecting the people from the police is the culture of the police department and the culture of the politics that governs the police department. And that's where the biggest problem in police reform occurs. Because if you have an attempt to make police officers effective, doing that is extremely complicated. So you have training, but you also have cultivation. So you're not merely training officers to perform particular tasks. You have to cultivate them to think a particular way. And part of that is to be treated in a way that's respectful. But it goes both ways. So if you want to see a good example of how police don't do it well, go back to the 60s and the 70s. And you look in the 1960s and 70s, and policing was all about restraint and clamping down on people. So there was no real idea of any kind of community policing where the police work with the community to solve problems. It was about actually constraining people to particular areas. And when Parker was in power in the city of Los Angeles, for example, he said, well, some people should be in the South Los Angeles, and we need to help them stay there and keep them there. And people in the North End or the center of Los Angeles, the different Hispanic groups and white groups, etc. Well, if you're using the police to enforce that kind of segregation, what do you expect is going to happen? Bad things are going to happen. But when you have that kind of belief coming from a chief of police, and the culture at the time accepted that, you end up treating the police differently. You're expecting them to do things like have quotas on arrests. That's not a good idea. If your whole idea of success is how many people you can throw in jail, then you've missed the point of why you have a police department. The police department is to work with the police. The police department is to work with the people to reduce the effects of criminals. And sometimes you do it without putting criminals in jail. Sometimes you do it by hardening the targets. But more importantly, you can't work with a public if the public just sees you as harsh and detached. And the police agencies at the time were harsh and detached from their officers. So this is a rather difficult metaphor to use, but it's as if when you beat the dog, what do you expect the dog to do? The dog's going to bite. And so you had a lot of that going on in the 60s and 70s. Police departments did not treat their officers well. And as a matter of fact, when you go into the 1970s, the police departments were very aggressive in trying to root out officers that they didn't like. They called them headhunters, the internal affairs people. And it was so bad that even the ACLU recognized that officers needed to have some rights.
Wow.
And so you had what was then a momentous act of police reform, which was to restrain not the police against the people, but the management against the officers, which was the first time in the history of the United States, and this was in California, where you had a peace officer bill of rights, which protected officers from all sorts of things that go on in investigations. We could get into it if we wanted to, but the bottom line is if you mistreat the officers enough, they will not behave properly. They'll do things to evade capture and detection, and you don't want that. So one of the problems that we had for decades started to slow down when you had that reform, where you're saying, okay, let's treat the officers like human beings to start with, and then we'll teach the officers to treat everybody else that way as well. That actually did work. That it started to change the way that the officers behaved and the way they viewed people. You also had a lot of training that went on inside the police departments to moderate their ideas of what their role was. So it went from being policing as a restraining system to policing as a cooperative venture with the public. So you went from a professional model to a community relations model. That's been very slow in rolling out, but that's more like that now than it has ever been in the past, although you have things like riots that slow that down. That's cyclical, by the way. I hate to say that, but it is cyclical. It goes in cycles, and it'll continue to do that. But in terms of police reform and what we've seen in the past, the first thing you have to do is to recognize that if the culture of the police department is the wrong culture, the officers will behave improperly. Mm-hmm. And if the politicians expect a certain thing from the officers, either tacitly or explicitly, the police chiefs will respond to it. And in the past, it was constrain certain groups. Now it's be thoughtful and be, I guess you'd say, kind, just, respectful to people, and efficient at the same time. It can be done, but some of the ways that politicians want to do it thwart the effort that they say they're trying to do.
That's helpful because you're really putting us on a path here of helping us understand what reforms have already happened, mm-hmm. In the culture from the 60s and 70s, shifts that have already been made. one thing I would just be curious to hear both you and Monique talk about is you were on the law enforcement side, back in the Rodney King riots in the early 90s. Monique saw those riots out her front door when she was.
I wonder if I drove by your house. I was down there.
Out in South Central LA and watching. I mean, the Reginald Denny got pulled from his truck just a couple blocks from her house, and martial law happened, and movements were restricted. But I'm just wondering, kind of from your point of view, in that, looking back on that now, on the Rodney King situation, did you see that actually did have a good outcome in changing police procedures, or was it just kind of all make believe and just sort of cosmetic changes? Like, was there actually a good outcome that came about after the King riots?
Well, it depends on your perspective. So in some respects, what it did was it changed police training, and that was good. What it did was it helped the police departments realize that there are certain cases where you can use something other than a baton. For example, there was one of the tactics that was developed after that.
We should maybe, even for our younger viewers, explain what happened in the Rodney King situation. Maybe that would be necessary. Okay,
so you had a police pursuit of a man who had been running away from the officers. He got out of the car. Some others got out of the car. The others that got out of the car obeyed the officers and got thrown out and arrested, and there was no incident with them. The one gentleman who did not was named Rodney King. He resisted. The officers were able to knock him to the ground, and he wouldn't stay still. At least that's the way the story goes. And so the officers continued to use batons on him and to try and get him to stop moving around and resisting. That was captured on video, and it looked horrible. Everybody who looked at it, including the officers who saw it on TV later on, said, "Oh my God, I can't believe I just saw that."
I mean, it was really the video seen around the world. Now everybody, these days we got a camera phone. Everyone's filming the police. Yeah. But, I think back then for your community, I'm imagining that was like,
shocked.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because it was I want to say the guy who shot it was like an amateur photographer, up in the valley, and just happened to look out his window and pulled his camera when he saw what was going on.
But from your standpoint in your community, was it like, oh, finally somebody got it on tape, that, something that you felt like, oh, this happens every day? Or
I didn't feel like it happened every day. I had heard the stories that this happens every day. That this is what, police do. This is what white people do. And so I had heard the stories, but this was the first time where I actually saw it in real time.
Okay. So, Mark, what you're saying is one thing that came out of that situation was training different. Oh, we don't always have to use batons. So I interrupted you, but I just want to give some context there for people.
Well, we don't have to go into detail on all the training, but the point is that it did actually affect police training, and it affected it in a good way, because there are more efficient and effective ways of doing that when you have a group of officers. We actually use less force and subdue the person much faster, which is good for the officers and the suspect and the public. So I hate to say that something good came out of something like Rodney King, but actually something did come out of it that was fruitful for the officers and the public. And it put a lot more emphasis on figuring out ways of using less force rather than just whatever force was available at the time, and to be more thoughtful in applying force, particularly when you had an overwhelming number of officers. So if you have 4 or 5 officers on one person, you really don't need to be using the baton. And the baton was, at the time when this happened, even the chief of police, who was on the witness stand during the trial, said these officers were not well trained. This was poor training, and we're going to redesign our training. So you look at what happened, and it wasn't just a bunch of malicious officers. It was officers who were using the tactics they were trained to do, and the training afterwards would make that same kind of incident not happen again. So in that respect, something fruitful did come from it. And a lot of discussions came out of that because, that what the police department at the time wasn't all white. There are plenty of black officers, and they were in supervision, they were in management, and they were aware of the discussions that were going on. And that was really an important point for the police department at the time, because when that happened, it allowed a lot of people to say things that they might not otherwise have said. Like, guys, are you really sure that this isn't the way things happen in places where nobody's looking? And so there was a lot of reflection, and it was a very good thing that a lot of openness came from that. And I think what it did was it created a sort of social conscience within the police department and other agencies as well.
Now, 2 years ago, we kind of went through a similar reckoning, I think, as a country. In the wake of George Floyd, there was a lot of conversations about even using social workers to de-escalate situations instead of the police. I know Monique's got certain feelings about that, which she might share, but from her 20 years of working in social service, I'm wondering though, Mark, what do you think about that strategy? Do you think that there could be some situations where that strategy could be useful, or is that just not a good way to go?
Well, the term have somebody come in and de-escalate is vague. What are you de-escalating? The situations are very, very significantly. So if you have two people who are on the verge of punching each other out or getting in a knockdown, drag out fight, you don't want a social worker there. That's a danger. That's a hazard to that social worker. But if you just have two people who are not getting along and they, for some reason, think that the police are going to solve that problem, then a social worker would be okay. The bigger question is, what's the frequency? So when the police get called to situations where people say, well, we should have social workers there, how often would a social worker actually be useful? And I think it's not very often. And the reason is that police usually get called because one or both of the people want some kind of enforcement action taken. And when you want enforcement action taken, you're not going to call a social worker to have that done. So that's why the police get involved. It's nice to say, well, we would like to de-escalate this, but until you're there and you're actually watching it unfold, you really don't have a clue what you're talking about. And most of the people who say, well, we should de-escalate this and it shouldn't happen this way, well, show up at one of those scenes where people are screaming at each other and MFing you and telling you they're going to beat you this and do that and so forth. And then say, oh, well, please just calm down. Please don't say that. It's not going to work. Those people are already beyond that threshold. So at that point, what the officers need to do is they're trained to do that, which is to calm people down, separate them, to minimize the degree to which they're trying to antagonize each other, and see if they can get some kind of resolution, at least temporarily, so that they're not hurting each other, already on the verge of hurting each other. It's at that point where the social worker can become very fruitful. But you don't want the social worker to be in there at first. So that you don't want to say, all right, look, we're going to send them to all of the calls where there are some kind of disputes. Bad news. That's a very, very bad policy. But if they are on call and an officer could get on the radio and say, hey, we could use somebody here to follow up on what we started. That, to me, makes sense. Whether there are enough social workers on the planet to do that is a good question, because there are more disputes than there are social workers to resolve them. But at least it's a tactic, it's a method of solving some of the problems. But just remember, you have to be realistic. People who are in these situations to begin with just don't handle life well. And a social worker working one time or even twice or three times isn't going to solve people's problems that were developed from their infancy or until they were, adolescents or adults. So it's a complicated problem, but it's not going to get solved by putting social workers in the place of police officers at first. And whether there's enough of them to do it in follow-up is an open question that society has to ask, whether they want to spend that money and whether they think it's going to work.
Yeah, I'm with you. I agree. I mean, there's already been a couple of social workers who have been killed going first. But I don't think that that's the role of the social worker. Like de-escalation techniques and all that, yes, those are a special skill set, but like you're saying, they have to be handled within the time of de-escalation. People don't understand that de-escalation is a window of time. Yeah. So if you decide, well, let me go in with my de-escalation, which is, to be fair, it is more than, hey, everybody calm down. It is more than that, but it still can't take the place of an officer who is armed and ready to be able to handle what de-escalation will never be able to handle. And there is a point where de-escalation techniques will not be able to handle some of the things a lot of the things actually that officers are facing. And so saying, we need to send in social workers first takes a lot of conversation. Mm-hmm. Each incident would need to be looked at individually. I don't know that we have the money or the manpower to be able to, or the time, to be able to say, okay, is this a social worker conversation or is this a police conversation? I think about the officer, I want to say it was in Ohio, and he showed up on the scene, and there was a girl, and she was a Black girl, she was a teen, and she was literally in the lunge to stab another teen girl, and he shot her. And people were like, where was the social worker? Why didn't they send in the social worker for de-escalation? Who gonna de-escalate that? Don't send me. Sorry, let's just be honest. Don't send me, because at that point we're way beyond a conversation of de-escalation. We are now at a life-threatening moment, and social work is not meant to address that. That is something that an officer is meant for to protect and to serve, to protect the individual that is about to potentially have their life taken. But there's a lot of conflation going on, like, hey, well, the social worker can handle that. The devil is a lie. The social worker cannot handle it, and not this one. You know what I mean? Like, we don't send people in for that. We have to be careful of what we're requesting and think about it in a more nuanced position than just, we don't want Black and brown bodies killed, so let's send in the social worker. Well, many times social workers are Black and brown bodies. And if they go into a situation where it's already hostile and people have already gone outside of their window of tolerance, what you're going to find is that whoever has the gun is going to be the one who comes out on top.
Well, do you think there's something, though, to Mark's point of, well, maybe the social worker doesn't go in first, but, on the back end, there might be some help there.
But I don't see that any different than what we already do.
What we're doing.
So let's say, something happens and people are arrested and there's domestic violence and all these things. There are social workers who then come in.
Okay.
Who then come in to assist children, to assist husbands or wives to be able to get things cleared up. You have, if there's like things that happen and courts are involved and all that, how do we mediate situations? How do we move forward? What are the counseling things that need to be involved? And so I'm like, I don't know, maybe Mark, maybe you disagree with me, but I kind of think that we already have a process that involves the social worker post an incident.
Yeah, you do when you have somebody arrested. Certainly you have that problem. Or if they're already in the social system to begin with. And I'm not suggesting a particular method of doing it. What I was getting at was the point that the social worker can't go in first, and that some of the situations are irresolvable, that you're not going to solve a person's problem who has very substantial emotional or mental problems in one visit of a social worker, mm-hmm. and certainly not of one visit of police officers who are well trained. So it's a bigger problem, and it's naive to think that just hand waving the term "have a social worker in there" is going to solve anything. I don't think it will.
That's good. Did you want to go back to a previous point?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
We'll just
All
keep
right.
going.
All right. So there's this website, and I sent this to Mark ahead of time so he could take a look at it. And I've seen a few pretty prominent big name evangelicals putting forward this website as, something pointing to something with regard to police reform and looking at it and saying, you know, these are things that Christians should get behind as police reform. And I don't come from a law enforcement family. I don't know that much about law enforcement. So I look at these things and, you know, maybe I can represent the average person in this conversation. I have no idea if these are good ideas or not. The name of the website is called 8cantwait.org. And it's, I gave it to Bob to put up there. And so if you can scroll down a little bit, Bob, there's some reforms there in those boxes of what reforms they're suggesting. But this, I don't know if these are good ideas or not. Monique read through some of them and she said, well, I think some of these we already have. I don't know. I'm just curious, Mark, what if you have any thoughts about these reforms? Do you see these as potentially helpful? Some of them we already have. I'm just curious if you have any general thoughts on this.
I do. I think there are probably some well-intentioned people putting this together who haven't got a clue about what they're talking about. And I don't mean that in a mean-spirited way, but truly, when I look at this and I see some of the things that are posted, and I'm looking at the site on my other screen over here, so I apologize for looking away.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at the diagram that's actually a chart, says requires de-escalation. Well, the requirement for de-escalation has been around for 20 years or more. So that's really nothing new. The next one has a use of force continuum. The use of force continuum has been around for at least 30 years, maybe even longer than that. It's been propagated in police training for decades. So I'm not quite sure why they would think that that's something novel. The question is what goes on in that continuum. So, you know, if they're claiming that's some kind of novelty, they're wrong. The next one is to ban chokeholds and strangleholds. Strangleholds have never been anything that the police departments wanted to do. It's ineffective. A stranglehold, it puts the arm against the throat. Same thing with a chokehold. And when you put your arm against the throat, actually that's a chokehold. All it does is cut off the air and turns the person into a panic. And at that point, the fight's even worse because the person is absolutely, I mean, you turn your oxygen off and you're going to fight to get that oxygen back again. It's like being thrown in the water and starting to drown, you panic. So that's always been something that at least police agencies that are sophisticated banned a long time ago, 40 years, maybe longer than that. The stranglehold, which is really kind of an odd name to put it, it should, you know, if you're going to use the term stranglehold, you have to define it.
Yeah.
There was a term, the upper body carotid restraint, and it goes by different names. And what that is, when you put the arm across the neck on the side to restrict the blood flow to the brain or to restrict the blood flow out of the brain. And what that does is it renders the person unconscious without permanent injury. And that's been banned in a lot of places since the 1980s. A lot of places didn't ban it for good reason, because it was very effective in preventing people from getting hit by batons, having trauma from other kinds of direct strikes. You know, if you have to beat somebody into submission rather than rendering them unconscious and letting them, you know, when you put the handcuffs on them while they're still unconscious, and it only lasts for about 10 seconds, you save them from a lot of injury. The problem with what they call a stranglehold, and I'm presuming they're talking about that carotid restraint, is that there have been a few deaths that correlated with it. In other words, somebody that was applied and the person died afterwards. And so they correlated the death with that particular use of force. And there were political influences to make it look like that was the cause, and while they were ignoring the fact that these people also had drugs in their bodies and had other physical ailments. So there were many of those deaths may have happened just from a protracted fight all by itself without using that carotid restraint. Nevertheless, it has been banned in most places. The state of California, for example, just passed a law to ban it. I think my own personal opinion is that if it's used properly, and it was used properly most of the time, it actually prevents more injuries than it causes. But politically, it's just not going to survive. So I look at that and I say, okay, if you think that's really a reform, okay, it's been there for a long time. Requires warning before shooting. You have to ask yourself, why would anybody come up with that? I mean, you don't just shoot people because you have 15 or 20 seconds to think about it. Most police shootings occur because there's something immediate. It's a snap decision. The person makes some movement that fits a pattern that the officer has been taught that corresponds to a deadly threat. When that happens, you don't have time to say, hey, would you please not pull that gun out and kill me? Because by the time you're done talking, or by the time you're done warning, you're dead. Mm-hmm. So when I said that people who have put this up there may be well-intentioned, they're hoping that you warn somebody and then they'll give up. That's naive. It's not even close to being practical or real. When you have a shooting of a situation like somebody pulls a gun out on you, there's no talking. It happens in less than 1.5 seconds from start to finish. So are there conditions when you might think of using it? Well, you might think of it if you have somebody who's armed, let's say, with a knife instead of a gun. And they're far enough away where you can tell them if you get any closer, you will get shot. But that depends on the distance. If they're right on you, you've got to shoot them immediately because they can kill you with a knife just as fast as they can kill you with a gun if they're close to you. And close to you means within a couple of steps. Mm-hmm. So if they're far enough away and you can say, look, don't drop the knife. If you come at me, you're going to die. Do it. Say that. But we're taught to do that anyway. Everybody's taught to do that. So I don't know that that's anything novel. The problem is if you say requires warning shots before shooting in all cases, that's absolutely unrealistic. The next one is restrict shooting at moving vehicles. This one is a particularly good one. Shooting at moving vehicles is generally speaking ineffective. If you shoot at a moving vehicle, several things can happen. One, you got a lot of stray rounds running down range, and you're putting people in a hazardous situation that you really don't want to. There are rare situations where it's a useful thing to do, but they're so rare that the policy itself could have that exception built into it. So, for example, if you're out in an open area and somebody comes on with it, let's say a four-wheeler shows up and you're in a football field and they're just circling around and they're trying to run you over repeatedly. At that point, you can't keep running away because the truck can keep going faster than you can keep running. And at that point, you don't have a choice. But all the rest of the times, suspects trying to get away, or they're shooting at the vehicle, they're shooting from the vehicle while they're driving away, or something like that. That's probably not a good time to be shooting at the moving vehicle. And the policy that would forbid that, or at least restrict it, is a wise policy. Many organizations have that now and have had. I know Los Angeles Police Department's had that for at least 10 years. No longer than that, about 15 years. And it was always one where, even before that, it was shooting at moving vehicles is perilous and may be fruitless. So that makes sense. That one's one that I think actually does make sense. Requires exhausting all other means before shooting. That's been part of the law and part of policies all over the country for as long as they've been, well, actually since the 1970s. And it doesn't mean that if it says requires exhausting all other means, that I don't know what in the world you would be exhausting if somebody pulls out a gun immediately, and what means are there? There aren't any other means. So there's nothing to exhaust. And so I guess they're thinking something like you punch them or do something like that. I don't know. But that one doesn't make any sense to me, exhausting all other means before shooting. The only time that makes sense is in a situation where there's time. So if the person's far enough away, doesn't have a pistol or a rifle or a handgun or something like that, or even a bow and arrow, because that shoots just about as fast as a pistol in practical terms, because the arrow goes so fast. But if they have a knife or a club or something like that, the officer should try to exhaust other means. Can they use a taser? Can they use some other device? Technologies are evolving on that. It makes sense to try to use other less than lethal force, but that's been built into the law and the policies for decades. It's nothing new. I would just say requires exhausting all other means when practical. I would add that to it, because there are times when it is not. And the last one, right, there's two more. One's a duty to intervene. That has been a policy for as long as I've been in policing. So whether police officers obeyed that and actually responded to it is a different question. But there is a duty to intervene.
Define what that is, the duty to intervene, because the
duty to intervene is a duty to stop other officers from doing what the officers know is wrong. So if, let's say, a suspect he's handcuffed, he's on the ground, he's not fighting, he's not doing anything, and another officer walks up and starts kicking him. Okay, the officers who are there have a duty to pull that officer away from him and report him. That's a duty to intervene. You intervene to protect the suspect from an attack against an officer that's unjustified. That's the duty to intervene. So that policy and those policies have existed for decades. For as long as the 36 years that I was in, that policy existed on Los Angeles Police Department and other places. When I was teaching police management all over the state, all the departments had that, and it was built into the policy, but not all of the officers would do it. So having a culture where they would do that is more important than the rule itself, because the rule itself is only as good as the officers who are going to obey it. The last one requires comprehensive reporting. I can only speak for the Los Angeles Police Department, but we've had comprehensive reporting since the 1980s. And I mean comprehensive reporting of every use of force, had a report that attended it. And those became statistical. And it was more than anything to determine which techniques and tactics were the most efficient. And were there particular individual officers who are more prone to using force than others? And if so, why? So it became an investigative tool, not in the sense of misconduct, but an investigative tool to determine whether somebody needs training or whether they should stay in the police work. Because if you get somebody who resorts to violence every single opportunity, that's probably somebody you need to look at moving out of police work. And so it was looked at then. And I completely agree that comprehensive reporting, if that means any use of force where somebody is likely to get injured, then I would agree with that. And they should keep statistics on that, and they should tie that, and what that doesn't say is that it should be tied to personnel metrics. And that's where you make your money on this. That's how you get your police reform. If you just report stuff and then just stuff the reports in a drawer, so what? Okay, you've got comprehensive reporting. But if it isn't until you tie that to some kind of metric, like what I just mentioned, which officers are together when the force occurs, which officers are alone when the force occurs. Does this occur when the people who they're using the force on are of a particular race? Does it occur under particular assignments? Those kind of data are extremely important and very, very useful in assessing whether your use of force policy is effective, your training is effective, or whether your officer is effective, your supervision is effective. None of that gets talked about when you talk about police reform, but when you're on the inside, and in my position as an executive looking at these kinds of things for decades, you realize that all of that has to go together, and anything less than that is simplistic. And that requires comprehensive reporting is simplistic if it doesn't tie it to metrics and to associating it with all the kinds of factors that would determine the efficiency and effectiveness of the officers and their training.
You have a lot of good points. Looking at the chart itself and the reforms that this site is looking to bring about. I think for, some of them, just like you were saying, yes, like this is something that, we should promote. Comprehensive, reporting is something that we should promote. And then there are others where, like you said, these things need to be evaluated on a case by case basis, or it needs to be more nuanced. What do you mean, that, let me see, require warning before shooting, but if somebody's shooting at me and then I have to shoot back, like, or did you think I wouldn't shoot?
It's a split second decision. It's not always time for a warning. It's not practical.
Well, I mean, I think and I could be wrong, and I'm open to that possibility, but it's like if you were shot by a police officer, I feel like there's very little chance that you wouldn't know that the possibility of you getting shot was there. Does that make sense? Like, yeah, there might be a one-off, situation where I had no clue that officer was going to shoot me, and I think that is something that we can look at. But by and large, when an officer, takes his gun out of the holster, the usual goal is to shoot. And the person who gets shot usually is doing something that is, I don't want to say shot worthy. That's not right. But, like they're doing something that would be illegal or a threat or something like that. Does that make sense? Like, I just don't feel like.
It does. But when you break down shootings, you have to break them down into different parts. So one part of them is the drawing and exhibiting. That's actually part of the assessment. Was the drawing and exhibiting proper? Was it necessary? Mm-hmm. So not all times when you draw your weapon are you necessarily going to shoot it, or else there'd be just a lot of shootings, and there aren't as many as people think there are.
Right.
So the other thing is when you're when you're looking at police shootings the way I have, and the way I've looked at it is overseeing the investigations of police officer shootings. And you look at the videos, you look at the transcripts of the interviews, you listen to the tapes of the recordings of the officers and the way they are describing what happened. If the suspect survives, you get to hear what the suspect said. You get to hear what everybody else said, and you look at the forensic evidence. And what you get from that is that most of the time when the shootings occurred, it occurred because they had to. Mm-hmm. The big question that you ask an officer, and it may not be in this exact word, but it is why. First is, what did you see? What did you perceive? And then the next question is, so why did you shoot? Why did you shoot round number one? Why did you shoot round number two, et cetera? You go round by round. That's the investigations go bullet by bullet. You have to account for every single one. And so the point of that is that when you're evaluating whether somebody's shooting is good or not good, the quality of the investigation that I've seen over hundreds of investigations has shown me that police officers don't just pull the trigger because it's fun. It's not fun. The investigation puts that officer through a ringer. It is not a comfortable feeling to be on the other side of an investigation because it's a homicide investigation. If you kill somebody, it's a homicide. Is it a justifiable homicide? That's the question. So the officer feels like a suspect. When he's interviewed, he has a lawyer with him. So it's not like the officer shoots somebody and it's on TV and he goes back to the station and then goes has beers with his buddy afterwards. No, it's an ordeal. So officers are not keen to shoot people. They really don't want to do it. It's not a fun thing. And many officers will tell you that they've told other officers in debriefs, they felt horrible afterwards. And so it gets around, officers don't give each other high fives and say, yeah, great job. No, it doesn't go like that. Occasionally you'll find someone will do something stupid like that, but the rest of them, no. It's rare when somebody is that kind of flamboyant fool. So the point is the shooting, if you look at the actual investigations, officers are not just shooting willy-nilly, and they're certainly not pulling the guns out willy-nilly because they know even drawing and exhibiting is its own question.
I think, another thing that you highlighted was actually about culture. and how if, you have all of these reforms and things like that in place, but people are willing to cover up or to have somebody's back or to, hide the reporting, or just put the reporting in a drawer, and never really investigate or look into these things. Well, that's not helpful either. So making sure that there is a healthy culture where people are held accountable and, and they understand, like, this is not just for the good of the citizens. Yes, it is for the good of the citizens. Yes, we want our citizens to be protected and to feel safe, but it's also for the protection of the precinct, or that culture of police in that area. So I thought that was very helpful as well.
I think too, when we're in conversations with people about justice issues and one of the main questions that people often have toward us at outreaches is, well, is it policing itself, systemically racist, and you're not here to address that, but that, I think a big piece of our answer to that question is, there's so many jurisdictions and many of those jurisdictions have their own policies, procedures, but they also have their own culture. And that's why having a very just culture is so important, because even if you have good policies in place, if you have corrupt leadership, then that is going to create problems. But that doesn't mean that the entire system, that all policing everywhere is corrupt. And so we have to really think about these things. And I think what I'm getting from this conversation is actually how important these internal investigations are, because that's a critical way of protecting the citizens, and that it's actually important for citizens to report and give accurate testimony about bad interactions with the police. Because if we're going to weed out corrupt police culture or corrupt cops, we have to, be able to report those people and think like, yeah, it will be looked into.
Yes, and certainly the whole internal affairs process is an interesting process. One of the things that I remember looking at when I was overseeing those kinds of investigations was the frequency in which we couldn't prove one way or the other. So there were no independent witnesses. You can't just take the officer's word for it. It ends up being not sustained. We don't know, and that those are troubling. We don't like those. But we occasionally would find cases where we could get evidence, and sometimes we found evidence that the people who were making the allegations were lying. Now, I remember one case where we had one person who constantly was doing it. And what the public doesn't recognize is that there are a lot of people who just hate the cops and they're going to make up things and just try to make the officers' lives miserable. And so internal affairs investigations really is designed to find the truth. And if it's that the citizen is lying, okay, then that's the way it goes. Can't do anything about it, except maybe a lawsuit by the officer against the citizen for defamation if it goes to that. But the officers themselves need to, the good thing about it is that the officers themselves, when they're vindicated, are truly vindicated. And when they're found to be sustained, the allegations are sustained against them, then it puts them into a process where they have the opportunity, the organization has the opportunity to assess whether the officer needs to stay in police work. And so you're right, Monique, that the internal affairs investigations are crucial. The quality of the investigators is crucial. The training that they get, and then also their techniques. I taught that for years. There are good ways of doing it, and there's some really bad ways of doing it. And so people don't realize that. They just, well, you send us internal affairs and it'll get done right. Well, if you are part of an agency that doesn't do very many of them, you're likely to hand that off to somebody who's not experienced. It's not as good of a situation as someplace like, in Los Angeles. It's hundreds of investigators who've got a lot of experience and they do a much better job. So I guess the bottom line to that is we hope that no matter where they are, that the agency itself will work as hard as it takes to get to the truth of the matter when a citizen reports misconduct, both for the officer's sake and for the citizen's sake. You're right, it is crucial.
Yeah. And I think it is important that, as people who are Christians who are involved in policing, part of our responsibility as Christians and the moral code that we live by as Christ followers is truth telling. It is not accepting bribes. It is looking at evidence, verifying evidence. These are all things that we get right from the pages of Scripture. And so, being an ethical leader, treating people with integrity, treating people in a way that is impartial, not showing favoritism. I mean, these are all principles from God's justice moral code. And so it is especially important for those of us who are Christians, I think, who are involved in law enforcement at whatever level, to act in a way that is consistent with what we're called to do as Christ followers. And if we happen to find ourselves in a corrupt precinct or under a corrupt situation where things are not being properly investigated, I would imagine, Mark, like, you would probably want to encourage those people to, take some steps or remedies to report that or go up the ladder or something. I mean,
yes, there are systems for that.
Yeah.
So that very question about, the people who are investigating this right now aren't doing the proper thing. There are ways of getting that solved. And in some places, they actually will take the investigation and send it to some organization outside of their own. So if you have a conflict of interest, for example, or the investigation exceeds the capacities of the agency. The other thing I'd want to mention about this is that it's true that as a Christian, whether we're in policing or out of policing, we should be looking for the truth. And one of the things that I would say is don't look for it in the news media, because you probably won't find it. And how do I know that? Am I just beating them up because they're easy to beat up or they're saying bad things about the police? No. I've been in policing long enough to know that there are some bad cops out there. They deserve a bad reputation. They deserve to get fired. They deserve to get sued. Some of them deserve to go to prison. I worked with a couple who did go to prison. So I know what it's like to have bad cops around, and it's hideous. So we don't like them any more than anybody else. But on the other hand, when I've, in many years, I've had situations where reporters reported on something that I was present at. I knew it. I saw it. I think I was all wrong. And I looked at the article, or I would see it on TV and said, did they even show up at the place that they're talking about? This is crazy. And so when I've over 36 years, I've seen that. I remember one time I got quoted in one newspaper, and it said something that was ridiculous. And then the chief of police sent me to a captain. My captain said, you need to tune this officer up because he shouldn't have said that. And I went and talked to the captain, and I said, I never said that. I never said that. And he laughed at me. He brought me into his office. He showed me an article. And in that article from the same newspaper, it had him referring to black people as the N-word. Now, mind you, this captain was black. And he never said anything like that. And he says, the reason I keep this is because I want other people who get victimized by these so-called journalists who don't know what they're writing and quote things that they shouldn't quote to realize it doesn't just happen to you, it happens to all of us. So get past it. And, as I went through my career, I got to see it a whole lot. But because the news media are so good at propagating things that are emotionally gripping, that once the emotion set in, belief follows. And that, as a Christian, you need to pay attention to, is that it is unjust to assume a position without knowing both sides of the equation. And the Bible says that too. It says, don't take one person's side until you've heard the both person's side.
Right.
And so the news media is one person's side, but remember, it's always affected by a profit motive to excite or distort in order to get sales.
There's a great comment on YouTube. I was going to go to that.
Yeah.
All right. Bob, it's on YouTube from Jenny. She says, is there any transparency to the public? Say a person reports a cop does something wrong. Can the public follow up to see what actions were taken to address it? And she says a sheriff in her town went to jail for corruption several years ago. It was local news reporters that actually discovered it, and they worked with outside agencies to get him. So, yeah, that's a good question. Like, is there also transparency about what's happening when files are reported? Is there a way for the public to look into that?
It depends on where you are, and it also depends on what the nature of the claim is. So in California, if you make a complaint against an officer, when the investigation is over, a letter is sent to you telling you what the results of the investigation are. They don't go in the public and say, hey, this investigation was closed this way. They just report it to the particular person who made the report. What they do with it, they can post it on the internet, burn it and make smoke signals out of it. It's up to them. But it is, in California, there is a requirement that the person who makes the report get told what the investigation concluded, and if it was found sustained, whether the officer suffered any punishment as a result of that. Now, as to whether the public can have access to other files is a completely different question, and it's one that's worth getting into, because in some states they have what are called sunshine laws. A sunshine law is a law that allows the public access to police files. Sometimes it allows access to the police files once they're concluded. Sometimes it allows them access to the police files while they're undergoing the investigation. They have some advantages and some disadvantages. California, for example, is not a sunshine state. Some people wish it were. I have personally seen the devastating effects of the so-called sunshine state laws, in that in one case, one officer, actually was a chief of police, was going through a really nasty divorce, and his wife kept sending, soon to be ex-wife, was sending these really horrible allegations against him. And as soon as they hit and were processed in the formal procedures, she would call the newspaper and say, hey, you need to check this investigation out. And so all of this stuff was being published as part of the ongoing investigation. So really, awful stuff that was completely untrue and untested, but because that state had access to that ongoing investigation, this became just sort of a tool for an angry, soon-to-be ex-wife to just beat up somebody in the news media. That can happen, and the problem is that the news media do not put things in context. So I can see at the end of an investigation, if the officer is found, if the case is sustained, publishing some parts of that would make sense. Maybe the punishment or what the charge was, et cetera, that makes sense. But while the investigation is pending, or cases that are not sustained or that the officer was found unfounded, those don't belong in the public. Those are things that can be kept private and confidential to prevent that kind of salacious defamation. So there is transparency some places. Most states now are moving towards a report to the person who made the report to tell them what the consequences were, or at least whether it was sustained, not sustained, or unfounded. So I hope that's at least somewhat responsive to your viewer's question.
One of the ways that people are calling for reform that isn't mentioned on the 8 Can't Wait site is immunity, for removing or stripping officers of immunity. Can you talk a bit about what immunity for an officer is and what the pros and cons would be about, stripping an officer of immunity?
Depends on what you mean by stripping them of their immunity. This is a very complicated legal question. Actually, there's a whole series of legal questions, and I really don't want to get into it, because once you start opening that up, there are so many little nuances that it becomes very difficult to explain to a lay audience. I'm even confused on some parts of it, and it changes. It's not the same all the time. But there are some cases, for example, we can be broad about it, where an officer would be immune to a lawsuit. So, for example, an officer hurt somebody, and it's within policy, and the city gets sued. Well, the city has to pay the damages on that, not the officer. The officer is immunized from that by a particular law that allows them to not get sued directly unless it's for punitive damages. So if you strip the officer of that immunity, if the officer becomes personally liable for every act that he performs in the performance of his duties, then the officer is going to, any lawsuit that goes against the city for the officer doing what he believes is actually supposed to be doing, he's doing it in good faith, he's going to stop working, because everybody would sue and the officer would have to pull money out of his own pocket to pay his own defenses. It's not even practical. You would, if you want to defund the police, strip that kind of immunity, and you'll just watch officers, once they start seeing each other getting sued and losing money out of their own pockets, they'll get into another occupation. That's not even survivable. So that's one form of immunity, but there are others, particularly when it comes to immunity from lawsuit when they violate somebody's constitutional rights. Did they know the constitutional right existed? And was it well known before the officer performed the act? What if it was something that that particular constitutional provision or case law was developed as a result of what the officer did? All sorts of really interesting technical questions. And that's as far as I want to go into it. I think we would get into some really deep weeds and confuse the issue of police reform.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Another thing that wasn't on the 8 Count website that I'm wondering what your thoughts are is the rise in body cams on law enforcement. Do you see that as being something that could potentially more jurisdictions should try to adopt? Is that a reform that you think could be good, that could protect both the officer and the person, the suspect, or whoever he's talking to or interrogating? Because then there's an automatic objective witness of sorts that they can look at more evidence. Maybe it would reduce even false reports. I don't know. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about body cams.
If the body cams are, number one, if they're turned on, because sometimes the issue is whether they turn them on, they can be useful for exactly the reasons you just mentioned. Number two, the body cams move around. They're not always in the position they need to be in, and they don't see a lot of what the officer sees. So they can be misleading in a systematic way, or I guess you call it an instrumentally systematic way. So because it only can see one direction at any given time and the officer's head is on a pivot, then you're not going to, if it's on his chest, for example, that's not going to help. Now, there are some cameras that can be affixed to let's say, glasses or to a helmet or something like that. That gets you a little closer. Those are unwieldy or could be unwieldy, but they're at least an option. Who knows what the technologies will come up with. The question about camera footage is always the most important one. So let's just presume that we have a mature technology. The technology is not intrusive. The officer can use it without having to worry about any kind of tactical problems or vision problems. Now we have to ask, what are we going to do with the videos that we have? So if it shows one thing and it wasn't showing some very important part of it, for example, what the officer sees or believes to have seen in peripheral vision, or that the camera just didn't pick up for whatever reason, then you have a problem of questioning the officer's statement based on a machine that didn't see what the officer saw, didn't hear what the officer saw, didn't see in 3 dimensions. There's no 3D cameras yet. Can't hear what the officers hear. Officers hear in more than just stereo. They hear it in all sorts of interesting directions. I mean, it is literally stereo in the fact they have 2 ears, but the directionality of the sound isn't the same in a camera as it is in a human ear. And the human ear is being processed by a brain that the The camera is not. And so when you download that audio and the video, you are not hearing what the officer heard. You might hear some gross features like a gunshot or somebody yelling or somebody talking. But what about the more subtle features that only the ear hears, or something that's subtle that only the eye sees, or some movement that was between the frames of a video? You know, if going 40 frames per second, the human eye sees a lot faster than 40 frames per second. So those are the problems that you have. There are technical problems, and what you're going to be doing with those videos, if you do not know what the restrictions, I shouldn't say restrictions, what the limitations of those are, you can make some very, very bad judgments based on them. So I would say overall, they're a good idea. Overall, they're better than not having. But if you don't have a clear idea of what the technologies are and what their limitations are, and you put them into practice in your policies and your evaluations, then they could be a problem.
Well, that's good. Those are some things I never really thought about, you know, with regard to that. So that's very helpful.
It's like,
Yeah. So another common question that we get a lot, and I'm just going to use a real life example of a friend of ours. And he's an African-American guy. I'm going to say maybe he's 38, 40, somewhere in there. And he, according to his account, he's been pulled over quite a lot. He said he's been pulled over 30 times. Now, Monique said to me before the show, she said, I think maybe he was exaggerating. So we'll just ratchet it down to half that.
Okay.
15. You know, maybe he was just being flowery. I asked him, like, are you being serious? And he said, yes. But
I missed that part.
Yeah, I think you had stepped out for a minute. But it did seem excessive to me. And this comes up a lot. And he's not like, you know, an anti-police guy. He's a very law-abiding citizen. He's a pastor here locally. He's a good guy. He's a very easygoing personality, but he seems to have gotten pulled over quite a lot. And we get this question with a good level of frequency. So maybe you can help us understand, like, what goes into a decision to pull someone over. I mean, I think that some people may have the impression that, you know, a person of color just drives by and, you know, oh, we're pulling them over, you know, that's what happens. But I'm thinking that maybe more goes into it than that. But I don't have a law enforcement background and would love if you could help me understand or make sense of these situations where somebody seems to be getting pulled over a lot when he's a consistently law-abiding person.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that is a very important question. So you have anecdotes like that, which is part of the reason why cameras on the officers are an important thing. This is a good case for a camera on the officers because it would tell us why the officer made the stop to begin with. Now, I've heard anecdotes like that too, and I tended to believe them because of the people who were telling them to me. Two of them were from police officers, Black police officers. They have no reason to lie about that. They have no reason to say, hey, you know, these guys are pulling me over just because I'm Black. They don't want to see that, but they're telling the truth. Some of them were other people that I knew who just weren't embellishers. They weren't trying to conjure up some kind of political case or something like that. So when I hear things like that, I take them seriously and I recognize that does happen. So now the question is why? Why is that happening? Why is somebody getting stopped so many times? And if it's not 30, if it's 15, who cares? It's too many, at least on its face. Now, I don't know if it's possible the person drives fast. I don't know. But here's the point. If I were being pulled over, let's say in a particular jurisdiction, over and over and over again, and I never got a good answer as to why I got pulled over, then I would start making complaints. I'd say I got pulled over and that officer never told me why. And this is the 5th time I've been pulled over. What's going on? What should go on in a traffic stop when somebody gets pulled over, what the law says is that you have to have a reason to do it. You have to either believe they committed a violation or they're about to commit a violation and you have reasonable cause to believe that some particular crime is afoot and this person is going to commit it or did commit it. So if you don't have a traffic violation, then it better be something you can articulate in terms of what crime you think they're about ready to commit or did commit. If you don't have those two things, you have no reason to pull a person over. So if I were being pulled over and it was happening all the time, I would just politely, you don't have to be a jerk about it, but just say, officer, can you please help me out? I don't really understand why I'm being pulled over. And then let the officer explain it. And if you don't get the answer you need, and it keeps happening over and over, then that's the time to start making complaints at the internal affairs and get the officer's name. Because if the internal affairs or the agency continually gets reports on the same officers, not necessarily one, you could have a whole crew of them who are doing it. And they start realizing, hey, we were getting a disproportionate number of these unknown stop complaints from these particular officers. It alerts the agency to a problem that they wouldn't get if you didn't make the complaint. So as much as I don't like seeing officers getting complained against, I do like seeing getting complained against when there's a reason to. And I think if you're constantly getting pulled over, regardless of what color you are, I don't care whether you're white or black or ultraviolet, if you're constantly getting pulled over and you're not being told why, or the reason that they're telling you that doesn't make any sense, you need to make a personnel complaint against the officer. And if it keeps happening over and over, eventually it's going to add up. And then those things do stop. I've seen it happen.
So I think that's just such a great answer. And I think one of the critical pieces that you said there that I caught was if it's a repeated thing in the same jurisdiction, then that could be, something to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what Mark said early on is that, yes, there are corrupt cops. Like there are sinful humans and sinful humans get jobs and some of them, are police. Yeah. And that's nothing to, just take lightly. Mm-hmm. Police have huge amounts of influential power, behind a badge and things like that. And so how do we, as citizens, make sure that we can also hold corrupt police accountable? There's not a conversation of, racist cops don't exist or things like that. And racist cops of any color. So I do.
Or corrupt cops.
Yeah, or corrupt cops, any kind of corruption. You want to, stand against that. Yeah. But I think this has been
very helpful Mark.
Conversation.
Yeah. And I think some of my takeaways from this are that the complexities of policing, like, the thing is that we want the police to help restrain evil. But when we also recognize that they have a lot of power. And so we also need good structures and policies that protect the people, the citizens. I think another takeaway I'm getting is all of the reforms that have been happening over the last several decades, and things continue to improve. We want that. And we as citizens also want to notice the policing in our area, to be grateful for those cops, but also to if we notice repeated problems, to speak up.
Yeah, I think it was helpful to hear this has already been addressed. This reform has already been made, because I think one of the things that you can hear in the media is that, all police are bad. All of these reforms need to happen, and they need to happen because all of these things are happening and they've never been addressed. Well, clearly that isn't true. Yeah. Another thing I would leave with or encourage people in is, Mark is saying definitely report the corruption when you see it, but also remember that our police officers are also public servants. And how do we treat our public servants? As Mark said earlier, if we didn't have police, well, then evil could just run rampant. And so we cannot just take lightly the position that someone puts themselves in becoming a public servant, especially a righteous public servant. So we want to, make sure that while we are reporting corruption when it needs to be reported, that we are also celebrating the officers in our churches, in our lives, in our community, thanking them, reminding them that they are appreciated for what they go out and do every day. Every day when a police officer, puts on that badge and that uniform and gets in that car, they are, in many areas, I know, especially like in South Central and especially around that 2020 time, they can become targets simply because they're wearing a badge or a uniform. And so, if you are a public servant, a police officer, thank you, for getting up every day and deciding to go again, even when a culture might be standing against you.
That's good. Mark, thank you. Any last words for us before we go?
The only thing I would say is that if you ever think about the police officers and you hear all of the terrible things you see on television, et cetera, there are a lot of things that officers do that people never know about, that the news media never report on. I can tell you in 36 years, I've watched police officers take people who were destitute, give them money, put them in a hotel and pay for it, buy them food, do acts of charity that people never knew about because they never broadcast it. They don't do anything other than what God puts before them. Not all of these guys were Christians. Not all of them were religious at all. They just did it because they came into the business because they wanted to help people. They do it in a lot of ways that people will never know. So when you do see an officer, you just look at them and say, somewhere along the road, this person has or will do something unbelievably charitable, and I should be thankful for it.
Well, thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you.
And love to have you back sometime and tackle another policing topic. But this has been so helpful and educational.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
Oh, thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
Okay, take care.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Wow, that was good.
That was.
I really enjoyed that.
Yes.
I learned a lot.
Yes, I'm going to address Susanna's comment. Susanna,
okay.
On YouTube, it's her handle is StuBlue2. And she says, I know why I am pulled over before I even speak to the officer. I have never experienced being pulled over for no reason. Is it because I'm white? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. But what I would caution against is the assumption that you have, I've never experienced being pulled over for no reason. I would caution against avoiding that assumption that, well, I've just never been pulled over, or, I always know the reason. And this has happened to me because I'm white. I am Black and I have been pulled over 2 times. One, because I walked out of the mall, the Fox Hills Mall, without going to the restroom. And I had to go so bad that I ran a red light and made a U-turn because there were no cars coming. And a cop pulled me over. I explained to the cop, this is my position. This is what's going on right now. He then turned on his siren and told me, we don't know his name, and this was years ago. He told me, he said, follow me and stay close. And he escorted me to a Jack in the Box so that I could go to the bathroom. There was that situation. Was it because I was Black? I don't know. I feel like, praise God for that cop, though, because it would have been a horrible situation. The next time I got pulled over, I was doing 90 down the 210 freeway. No, down the 5 freeway coming from Santa Clarita. And the cop pulled me over and was like, do you know why I pulled you over? And I said, yes. And he was like, why? And I said, because I was doing 90. And he was like, you're right. And there it is. And I got a ticket for it. But the same way that I knew why I was being pulled over, Susanna, is the same way that you knew why you were being pulled over. So we don't want to make the assumption that, maybe it's because of skin color. I think a lot of culture does that. And this is not just for you, Susanna, but for anybody. A lot of cultural conversations happen from that point of, well, that only happens because you're white. Well, no, there are, I know many Black people who have never been pulled over a day in their life. So we just have to, without evidence, I think that's one of the things that you hit on, is like, we need evidence. So we don't want to say, well, this only happened to me because I'm white, or this only happened to me because I'm Black. What is the evidence to support the claim?
Yeah, that's good. Well, do you want to do the tweet, or you want to just be done? we're over time.
I kind of just want to be done. I'm a little sleepy.
We had a big day.
Yeah, if I'm honest.
All right. So we're going to be done. Well, this has been good. And we're going to continue to talk about policing. Yeah. This is not like all of the topics. I think Mark did a great job in helping us tackle police reform, gave us a lot of things to think about. And if you have thoughts about policing or topics you would like us to tackle in the future, send them into the show and let us know kind of, what you would like us to do. I've got at least another idea to maybe have Eric Muldrow back on at some point.
Yes.
And talk more about, but this is an important conversation that our country is having. And I think we've got a couple of really good guys to help us think about it.
I think so too. And it's really important. I know everyone wants to protect the citizens from the police. That's the big conversation right now. From my heart, and I'm not negating that. I'm not saying that that's not important, but it's also equally important to have equal weights and measures. So how do I also protect the police if they need that from certain citizens? Like, we both know someone who is connected to an officer in who was present during the George Floyd riots. And this officer was locked inside of
right by the epicenter.
Was locked inside of the precinct, I think, while they started to burn it down. And
he thought he was going to die in that building.
Yeah. And, so how do we come alongside and say, I'm not going to show partiality. I'm going to, make sure that each side is protected, that each side is cared for, because our culture will damn and villainize the police officers to a degree where we just think that they are all evil, ruthless, hard-hearted, and things like that, and think that they don't need protection. But these police officers that are getting up every day to come protect and serve also have families, and we can't forget that. Now, am I saying that, every police officer is righteous and holy and, loving Jesus? No. And yet, they're created in the image of God, and we're not going to treat someone with partiality. So I'm also going to say, hey, this image bearer also deserves the protection that I would give to this person here. Yeah. So just things to think about.
Yeah, it's good. Well, friends, we will see you next week for another show. And we are looking forward to continuing the conversations. Let us know how you enjoyed the show, what your thoughts are. You can email us and or put your comment on Facebook. And just looking forward to continuing the conversation. So that's it. Good night.
Good night.
God bless.
There's nothing left.